Hello YouTube. Antinatalism is the view that it is morally wrong to have children. In this video I want to discuss an objection to antinatalism, that antinatalism has certain harmful consequences. So Christine Overall, in her book Why Have Children, argues that antinatalism would be harmful to women if it were widely adopted. So antinatalist beliefs, if they were widely adopted, would be harmful to women. There's a few different ways in which this worry might arise. So, first of all, there's the worry that if antinatalism becomes widely accepted, then it will be women who will get most of the blame for reproduction. Antinatalism says that reproduction is morally wrong, and it's going to be primarily women who are blamed for this moral wrong. And this is because it's only women who can become pregnant, and therefore women who bear the primary responsibility for reproduction. Any woman who does not take adequate steps to prevent pregnancy is blameworthy. Now, of course, look, pregnancy takes two people. That's true, but I mean, ultimately, the pregnancy happens in the woman. It's the womb. That's where the person is actually created. So the primary blame is going to end up lying with the woman. Moreover, if a woman becomes pregnant, it's up to her whether to terminate the pregnancy, at least where abortion is accessible. So, assuming that the fetus is not a person or is not sentient, assuming the fetus is not a moral patient, antinatalism will entail an obligation to abort, right? You should abort the fetus before it becomes a person or before it becomes sentient, in order to prevent a person or a sentient being from coming into existence. And so any woman who sees through a pregnancy, any woman who fails to abort, is thereby doing something blameworthy. And so we can see that the majority of women are going to end up being blameworthy for this reason. I guess the point here is, look, the gendered nature of procreation means that the responsibility for procreation falls primarily on women. In the majority of societies, the majority of women do become pregnant. Antinatalism entails that pregnancy produces bad consequences. Pregnancy is morally wrong. You ought not to do it. And if it happens, you ought to stop it. You ought to abort it as soon as possible. So if antinatalism became more widely accepted, primarily women will be condemned. Antinatalism is going to condemn the gender that has already suffered historical oppression. So in this way, antinatalism will lead to more negative views of women. Another way that we might worry about antinatalism here is that in more misogynist societies, women's status is tied to their role in creating and raising children. Raising children is often seen as women's primary social contribution. It's one of the very few sources of dignity and respect that they can get in those societies. It's one of the very few ways that a woman can be sort of respected for her contributions. Most misogynist societies are still going to see women positively for their role in nurturing a family and all of that. Indeed, those sorts of attitudes are not uncommon even in more socially progressive societies. So if we adopted antinatalism, this contribution would instead be seen not as positive, but as a liability. So women in misogynist societies would lose even the very precarious social status that they have. Consider societies where female infanticide has been common, where female children were of lower value. How much more common would that be if people saw reproduction as negative? If people saw it like it is a negative thing to bring new children into existence? Such societies would recognise hardly any role for women at all. So there are two ways that antinatalism may harm women. First, because if antinatalism were widely accepted, it would be primarily women who would be blamed for procreation. And second, because if antinatalism were widely accepted, women in misogynist societies would lose even more status. A similar worry might be raised that antinatalism it could lead to racism or is racist in certain ways. So first of all, for people in rich countries refraining from procreation has no major economic costs. Indeed, in economic terms, you're likely to be much better off without children. Children are a great expense for most people in rich Western societies. But for people in poorer nations, so these are people whose lives are already deprived in serious ways relative to ours, refraining from reproduction may involve significant costs. There are many circumstances where, from a young age, children will, be put to work, that they'll help to provide for the family and so on. And moreover, as parents age, it is expected that their children will take care of them. Without the robust welfare systems of the sort that are found in richer countries, the elderly rely on their families for care. So, one issue here is that anti-natalism is going to impose a disproportionate burden on people who are already severely disadvantaged, right? Like if we say you ought not to reproduce, well, for somebody like me in a rich Western country where we have good benefit system, good welfare systems and so on that can take care of me as I age, well, that's actually fine. Indeed, it means I'm probably going to have more money to spend in my free time. I'm going to have more leisure activity and so on. But when we look at certain poorer countries, if you're saying there's a moral obligation not to reproduce, that's going to impose a massive burden on them. So antinatalism ends up being sort of judgmental of people in this discriminatory way. It imposes this unfair burden. A second worry here is that antinatalism might sort of lead to racist attitudes. It might encourage certain racist attitudes. And this is because fertility rates differ widely across ethnic groups. It's primarily only African countries that have very high fertility rates. I mean, in a lot of countries of the world now, fertility rates are below replacement level. So, from an anti-natalist point of view, that's not perfect, but, it's like, okay, well, we're trending in the right direction insofar as the population is not, growing. If you stay below replacement level, the population is going to shrink, right? African countries have very high fertility rates, or at least many of them do. So, if antinatalism were widely accepted, we would have to say that these African populations are engaging in a greater amount of morally problematic behavior. I mean, it's primarily these African populations who are doing morally problematic things. Now, of course, that's not in itself racist, because there can be, if ever you say that a particular ethnic group is doing things that are morally bad, there can be non-racist explanations for why that is. We can recognise that some ethnic group has a higher rate of morally problematic behaviour without thereby condemning that ethnic group in virtue of their ethnicity. But although we can do that, we have to recognise that many people won't do that. Many people are tribalistic, many people are bigoted, many people are just idiots, and they're going to ignore the more complex explanations and just instead adopt sort of racist attitudes. So if antinatalism were widely accepted, it would sort of pour fuel on the fire of racist sentiments. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to focus on the sexism challenge, but I just thought it's worth bearing in mind that there are other ways to run the harm argument, right? There are many ways in which we might say that antinatalist beliefs could lead to harm or discrimination or whatever. So before continuing, though, just a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can join my Patreon. I have a whole bunch of bonus videos on there, so lots of bonus content. More of me is available on my Patreon, or you can just send a one-off donation on PayPal. Anything you can give me, it really helps. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, master's, and PhD in philosophy, so that's my academic background there. And there's also a Discord. All the links for this will be in the description. And of course, I should also say that, if you can't do any of that, well, give the video a like, leave a comment, because that helps too, right? Let's do it for the YouTube algorithm, okay? Right then, let's get back to antinatalism. So we've seen then a couple of ways of making this harm argument. What should an antinatalist say about this? Well, one obvious line of response is to dispute the harm thesis. We can just deny that and that anti-natalist beliefs would lead to these harms. And I do think that, so Christine Overall in particular, I think she somewhat overstates her case on this point. For instance, she says that antinatalism implies that, and I quote, women's reproductive labour in pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, and even rearing children contributes to the accumulation of net harm on this planet. So, I mean, what she's saying is that, you know, if antinatalist views were to become widely accepted, people would end up thinking that all of this labour that women do in becoming pregnant, in giving birth, in breastfeeding, in rearing children, all of this labour is, you know, morally bad. It contributes to net harm. And so we would end up condemning women for all of this. But, I mean, that's surely an overstatement, because according to antinatalism, it's only procreation specifically that is a harm. It's only the, you know, becoming pregnant part that's a problem. Antinatalists are not committed to the view that raising a child contributes to net harm. You know, the most famous antinatalists, people like David Benatar, deny this explicitly. A person may, in fact, be doing a very good thing by raising a child. I mean, Benatar points out that, like, if you adopt a child, for instance, well, you're raising a child. You're raising a child who already exists, and that can be a very, very good thing to do. You can be contributing to, you can be doing a lot of good by adopting a child. So yes, if you procreate, you've done something you ought not to do. But once the child exists, you do a very good thing by raising it to have as good a life as possible. So insofar as producing and raising children is seen as the responsibility of women, women may still be valued for their input with respect to raising children who already exist. Or consider Overall's point that in misogynist societies, one of the only ways that women can gain respect and social status is through raising children. Antinatalism, if it were widely accepted, would deprive them even of this. The trouble with this argument is it's hard to see how such societies would convert to antinatalism without significant changes elsewhere in their moral outlooks. I mean, very often, both pronatalism and misogyny have a common source. For instance, acceptance of fundamentalist religious views. Right? So there are certain religious views which imply both pronatalism and misogyny against women. So, you know, in that sort of society, well, they're only going to convert to antinatalism by giving up important tenets of their religion. But once they give up central tenets of their religion, that's going to militate against the misogyny, because the misogyny is also a product of those religious views. Or at least, you know, those religious views may be playing a significant role in the misogyny. I mean, a common aspect of sort of misogyny and gender oppression is the assumption that women ought to be mothers, that this is, you know, this is the role they ought to play. There's some norm, there's some kind of, you know, rule that this is what women should be doing. If antinatalism became more widely accepted, that sort of attitude would no longer be common. Women would be encouraged to do other things with their lives instead. And so, I mean, I think antinatalists can bolster their case here by emphasizing the various potential harms of motherhood, the physical risks of pregnancy, the unpaid labor of raising children, patriarchal norms associated with procreation, all that sort of stuff. It really seems unlikely to me that the sort of people who endorse antinatalism would also endorse these kinds of misogynist attitudes that devalue women. I mean, of course, you know, look, people are not consistent. I mean, so who knows what would happen? But it does seem like in a lot of cases, in order for a society to convert to antinatalism, it's going to create significant changes elsewhere in their moral outlook that would, you know, that would put women in a better position, that would remove or at least militate against the misogyny. There's a more general point here as well, which is I think that, you know, previous cases should lead us to perhaps doubt the harm thesis. In the past, people have raised the same worry about many philosophical positions. So there are many philosophical positions where there's this worry that they're going to cause indirect harms. So the harm objection has been made against atheism, against moral anti-realism, against epistemological skepticism, against the denial of free will, against various forms of relativism, and so on. But in all these cases, the harm hasn't really materialized. So atheists do not behave significantly worse than theists, and populations that are mostly atheist are not significantly worse than populations that are mostly religious. Similarly, moral anti-realists do not behave significantly worse than moral realists. If you come to endorse moral anti-realism, that doesn't seem to weaken your own personal moral commitments or your basic values or anything like that. I think that, in general, our behavior towards others is not really driven by abstract philosophical theses, right? I mean, there's a variety of factors that motivate our behavior. And I mean, at best, right, the sorts of abstract philosophical arguments we endorse, they play a very minor role. They're just one factor among many, and I don't think a particularly significant one. So, I mean, what is it that is actually going to cause misogyny, that's actually going to cause harm against women? Well, that's a very complex question. But the sorts of factors we might cite are going to be things like, conventions and attitudes that are inculcated during a person's upbringing, certain, rules, say, that enforce gender segregation in particular institutions, maybe certain religious beliefs, poverty, economic inequality, workplace discrimination, all of that sort of stuff. And anti-natalism is tangential to all of this. I mean, of course, there are connections. Anti-natalism has connections to all these things, because if people chose to stop having children, that would significantly change society in a variety of ways. But it's not obvious that these changes are going to cause more misogyny. Social attitudes are dependent on a variety of complex factors, and they change in unpredictable ways. So it seems I think the jury's still out at best. Let's say that. I mean, ultimately, the harm thesis is an empirical argument, right? It's an empirical claim. The empirical claim is that if anti-natalist beliefs became widely accepted, then there would be more misogyny against women, there would be more harm against women. Is there convincing empirical evidence for that? I think that at best the jury is still out. Okay, so assuming, though, that the harm thesis is true, a second response here is that the harm thesis is just irrelevant to the arguments for antinatalism. It's irrelevant to the arguments for antinatalism because the question what's in question here is whether antinatalism is true, not whether antinatalism has harmful consequences. Now, I should note that Overall herself actually grants that the harm thesis does not bear on the truth of antinatalism. But then we might wonder in what sense it's supposed to be an objection to antinatalism. I mean, what we want to know when we're assessing antinatalism is whether it is permissible to reproduce, right? I mean, is that the case? Is that the correct moral theory? Or to frame this in terms that are less realist, is this the moral theory that follows from our basic values, or is this the moral theory that is, most coherent with our moral intuitions, or whatever? Now, if the harm objection is right, all that follows is that we ought not to believe antinatalism. But that's a different question from whether antinatalism is correct, because in this case, the reason why we ought not to believe antinatalism is not that it is incorrect, but that the belief would have harmful consequences. I mean, I think in general, we shouldn't assume that the correct moral theory will be such that it follows that we ought, all things considered, to believe that theory. So consider the following scenario. Suppose that there's a super powerful evil demon that tells us that if we come to believe antinatalism, then he will condemn all people to infinite suffering. Well, in that case, surely we're not going to believe antinatalism, right? We ought not to believe antinatalism. We will try to avoid holding this belief. We will judge it to be wrong to promote the beliefs to others. Even so, it may still be that antinatalism is true. It may be that it is morally wrong to procreate. What would be happening in this situation is that the demon would be coercing us into holding a false moral belief. Of course, there's nothing here that's unique to antinatalism. We could replace antinatalism with any other position. When a demon tells us that if we believe that P, then he will condemn all people to infinite suffering, well, surely we ought not to believe that P. But, I mean, the thing to notice is that there may be situations where there are features of the actual world that are analogous to the demon, because beliefs have various effects on the world. Some of these effects may be negative. If the harm is great enough, then we may well judge that it would be better not to hold the belief, that we ought not to hold the belief. Now, it's an empirical question whether belief in antinatalism would cause serious harms, but the answer to that question has no bearing on the truth of antinatalism. In the same way, right, if there were this demon who was, he's going to condemn all people to infinite suffering if we believe antinatalism, that has no bearing on the truth of antinatalism. At the end of the day, I mean, antinatalism isn't a view about what we ought or ought not to believe, nor in itself does it entail anything about what we ought or ought not to believe. All antinatalism is, right, all the antinatalist says is that we ought not to procreate. That's it. It doesn't say we ought to believe or ought not to believe whatever. It just says we ought not to procreate. So it's not an objection to antinatalism that we ought not to believe antinatalism. Moreover, the arguments for antinatalism are not arguments for the conclusion that we ought to believe that antinatalism is true. They are arguments for the conclusion that antinatalism is true. Like the proposition, right? The proposition that we're deriving from these arguments is not we ought to believe that procreation is impermissible. The conclusion is simply procreation is impermissible. So it's not an objection to the arguments for antinatalism that we ought not to believe antinatalism. So the antinatalist might just accept the harm thesis, and then say, well, yeah, okay, fine. We ought not to believe antinatalism, but it's still true. That is open to them. The third point here, though, is that suppose that antinatalism does harm women. Let's just grant that that's the case. Well, if antinatalism is true, then procreation is also a significant harm. And certainly if antinatalism were to become widely accepted, then, okay, if given the harm thesis, we can expect that there would be greater harms to existing women, but we should also expect that fewer people would reproduce, which would prevent significant harms, right? It would prevent women from coming into existence, and so in that sense, right, although there would be, so like the idea is that, look, antinatalist beliefs they cause harms to existing women, but antinatalist beliefs are going to lead fewer people to reproduce, and so there's going to be fewer women being created who could be the subject of these harms. So, I mean, so the antinatalist is going to end up. Antinatalist beliefs will prevent significant harms as well. So I suppose we now have to ask, well, is it what outweigh which is greater, as it were? I mean, is the harm being done greater, or is the harm being prevented greater? I mean, presumably, when we're assessing the harm thesis, we're going to want to show that the harm done by antinatalist beliefs outweighs, or is in some other way more morally significant than, the harm that those beliefs play a role in preventing. So, like, when evaluating the harm thesis, it's not enough to look only at the harm done by antinatalism. We have to look at the harm it prevents, and it's going to prevent harms by preventing people from coming into existence in the first place, which prevents them from being the subject of these harms. So there's an interesting sort of paradox here, because if antinatalist beliefs do harm women, then one of the harms that antinatalism prevents is precisely this very harm. So, I mean, after all, if we refrain from bringing women into existence, then antinatalist beliefs couldn't harm them. So, like, if I initially intend to have children, but then I convert to antinatalism, that has prevented a harm. One of the harms it has prevented are the harms caused by that antinatalist belief itself. Antinatalist beliefs can only harm women if those women are brought into existence in the first place, but if antinatalism were widely accepted, there would be far fewer women being brought into existence, and of course far fewer men being brought into existence. So there's this interesting feature of the harm thesis in that, in a sense, it becomes grist to the anti-natalist mill. This is because the case for antinatalism appeals to the harms of existence. So the case for why we ought not to believe that antinatalism is true becomes part of the case for why antinatalism is true. What makes it that we ought not to believe that procreation is impermissible is partly what makes it that procreation is impermissible, namely the harms done by the belief in antinatalism. So those are a few ways that antinatalists might respond to the harm objection. Now, before ending, I want to turn to a different sexism objection that Christine Overall makes. So she raises this objection not to antinatalism in general, but to a common argument for antinatalism, Benatar's asymmetry argument. I have another video in which I explain the asymmetry argument in detail, so I'm only going to outline it briefly here. I'll link that video in the comments. So Benatar argues that there's an asymmetry between pleasure and pain, right? And it goes like this. So the presence of pain is bad, the presence of pleasure is good, the absence of pain is good, even if the good is not enjoyed by anybody, the absence of pleasure is not bad, unless there is somebody for whom that absence is a deprivation. Now, as a result of this, if we consider two scenarios where, there's a scenario where the person exists versus a scenario where the person never exists, well, in the scenario where the person comes into existence, there's going to be both bad and good. There's going to be the presence of pain, which is bad. There's going to be the presence of pleasure, which is good. In the scenario where the person never exists, there's just good and no bad, because there's the absence of harm, which is good, and there's the absence of pleasure, which is not bad. The absence of pleasure is not bad. And the reason why this is the case is because in the case of the absence of harm, that's good even when there's nobody to enjoy the good. Whereas the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there's somebody who feels deprived from not having the pleasure. So basically, coming into existence is always going to be a net harm, at least assuming that there's any pain at all in a person's life. Even the slightest degree of pain will mean that that the existence of that person is a net harm. Because if they never exist, it's just good. There's just goodness and no badness. If they come into existence, you're going to get badness and goodness. That's the basic idea. So we have this case for antinatalism on the basis of this asymmetry between pain and pleasure. But now, why should we believe that there is this asymmetry between pain and pleasure? Well, according to Benatar, we should believe this asymmetry because it explains other asymmetries in ordinary moral judgment. Of particular relevance to Overall, it explains an asymmetry of procreative duties. So it's commonly thought that there is a duty to avoid creating people who would suffer severely, whereas there is no duty to create happy people. So, in general, there is no duty to procreate, no matter how happy a life the potential child would have. The duty, so there's a duty not to bring into existence people who would suffer, but there is no duty to bring into existence people who would be happy. Now, this duty not to bring into existence a child who would suffer lies in the fact that the presence of pain would be bad and its absence is good. By contrast, with the potential child who would have a very pleasurable life, the absence of this pleasure is not a bad thing if that child never exists to be deprived. So, according to Benatar, well, this explains why there's no duty to bring into existence people who would have very happy lives, because the absence of that happiness is not bad. If they don't exist, then there's nobody who would be deprived. There's nobody being deprived of the happiness. So Benatar says that one of the reasons why we should believe the pleasure-pain asymmetry is because it explains why there is a duty to avoid creating people who would suffer severely, but there is no duty to bring into existence people who would have happy lives. Now, Overall objects that this defense of the asymmetry thesis misses the actual reason why there is no duty to create happy people. The actual reason there's no duty to create happy people is because a duty to create happy people would severely violate women's bodily autonomy, right? So, we'd be saying there's a duty to become pregnant, which is, as Overall sees it, just obscene, right? We respect women's control over their own bodies. So we're not going to say that there's a duty to undergo 9 months of pregnancy, to give their bodies to the creation of another person in ways which significantly impair their normal functioning and which may threaten their health. I mean, even if even if you're like opposed to abortion and you think that once a fetus is implanted in a woman, once a fetus is there, it has certain rights, and women should be, we have to sort of weigh the rights of the fetus against bodily autonomy. That's one thing, but what we surely don't want to say is that there is a duty to create a fetus in the first place. Well, actually, some people would say that. I have a video on arguments for pronatalism, which imply that there actually is a duty to procreate. But let's put that aside. Certainly, that's a far less popular thesis. I suppose we can say this, and this is something that Overall would say is, the idea that there is a duty to become pregnant. Overall would say that is sexist. It's misogynist. Now, Benatar's asymmetry argument ignores this. It's not the pleasure-pain asymmetry which explains why there is no duty to reproduce. It's simply that women have the right to control their own bodies and protect their individual well-being. That's what explains why there's no duty to reproduce. Now, Overall's objection, as I understand it, is that Benatar's asymmetry argument has a sort of troubling implication. It commits him to a troubling conditional. From Benatar's point of view, if it turns out that the asymmetry does not hold, so if we discover that the absence of pleasure is bad, or that the absence of pain is not good, or whatever, then it would follow that there is a duty to reproduce. So Overall says, Benatar is claiming that women's right not to reproduce has a rather precarious status. Their right not to reproduce is conditional on the asymmetry thesis. And the asymmetry thesis is very controversial. There are plenty of philosophers who reject the asymmetry thesis. So their right not to reproduce is conditional on this very controversial philosophical thesis. But it is inappropriate to make the right not to reproduce conditional in this way. So I guess one way to look at this is that, we can assess a person's moral sensibilities, not just in terms of the moral positions that they actually endorse, but in terms of what would lead them to change their moral positions. So we assess a person's moral sensibilities in terms of how they conditionalize their moral positions. Suppose that Frank agrees that women do not have a duty to become pregnant. But then he says, if we discover that pregnancy has no risk of death, then women have a duty to become pregnant. For Frank, the only reason why there's no duty to undergo pregnancy is that there's a risk of death. If you remove this risk, then he thinks that there's a duty to become pregnant. Overall would say that Frank's moral sensibility is defective. Frank is sexist. He's misogynist. For Frank, the fact that pregnancy involves significant bodily changes, which may cause pain, which may impair normal functioning, which last for a significant period of time, that's irrelevant, right? Women have no general moral right to control their own bodies and take care of their own well-being. They only have a right to avoid the risk of death. That's it. That's it. And that seems kind of sexist. So Overall would say. Now, by endorsing the asymmetry argument, we conditionalize our commitments in a way that is similarly problematic. The asymmetry of pleasure and pain is what explains why there is no duty to reproduce. So we endorse the conditional. If we discover that there is no asymmetry between pleasure and pain, then there is a duty to reproduce, which means women have a duty to undergo pregnancy. And Overall would say it's just not appropriate to conditionalize the moral right to refuse pregnancy in this kind of way, right? It's fine for women to refuse pregnancy, even if it turns out that the asymmetry thesis is false, because what makes it the case that it's okay to refuse pregnancy has to do with bodily autonomy. It doesn't have anything to do with, these sort of more abstract philosophical theses about the nature of pleasure and pain. So, the challenge is that if we endorse this defense of, the particular defense of the asymmetry argument that Benatar gives, then we end up being committed to this sort of sexist conditional. So in response to this, I suppose the anti-natalist might say, well, there are multiple reasons why there's no duty to reproduce. On the one hand, we can grant that we can grant the feminist argument that one of the reasons why there is no duty to reproduce is bodily autonomy. But then we might say that this alone doesn't accommodate all of our intuitions about procreative duties. Indeed, this is a point that Benatar himself makes. In defending the asymmetry thesis, he says that intuitively there is no duty to create happy people, even if this comes at no cost to ourselves. So suppose you could press a button which would create a person whose life will be nothing but extreme suffering. Well, surely you ought not to press that button. It would be a bad thing to press that button. It would be bad to just bring into existence somebody who's just suffering endlessly, right? Suppose you could press another button which would create a person whose life would be extremely good by any normal standard. Well, seems like there's no obligation to press that button. You don't do anything bad by failing to press the button, by failing to press the button and bring into existence somebody who has a happy life. In fact, even if you think that there is an obligation to press the button and bring into existence the person with a happy life, I suspect the intuition here won't be as strong as the intuition that there is an obligation not to press the suffering button. Our aversion to pressing the suffering button is much stronger than our attraction to pressing the happy life button. And so we might think that, look, we can't explain this by appealing to bodily autonomy. If we postulate that there is a duty to press button 2, that doesn't violate bodily autonomy in any way. I suppose you have to use your finger to press it, but it's not like there's something growing inside of your body for 9 months, right? So the bodily autonomy arguments just aren't relevant here. So we need to appeal to something else. And maybe what explains our different intuitions about these cases is the asymmetry between pleasure and pain. But the point here is we can accept Overall's point that we must not conditionalize the denial of a duty to reproduce on the wrong thing. But that just means that there must be multiple reasons why there is, in fact, no duty to reproduce, in addition to the asymmetry between pleasure and pain. I think that the anti-natalist can still argue that there is an asymmetry between pleasure and pain, and that this asymmetry explains our views about procreative duties, without necessarily committing to the sexist conditional that if the asymmetry thesis is false, then there is a duty to reproduce. Okay, well, that's that for that video. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye all.